Welcome to another episode of the Film Florida podcast. My name is John Lux, and I'm the Executive Director of Film Florida. Thanks for downloading this episode of the podcast. Before I introduce you to our guest, if you haven't already done so, please make sure you subscribe, rate, and review the Film Florida podcast. Also, we have a Film Florida merchandise page. Visit teespring.com/stores/Film Florida to purchase Film Florida t-shirts, sweatshirts, and coffee mugs. Today, our guest is comic industry legend Bob Layton. Bob is a creator, writer, artist, designer, and entrepreneur with over 6,000 comic book credits to his name. Bob is perhaps most known for reinventing the Iron Man comic in the late 1970s, taking it from near cancellation to one of Marvel's all-time best-selling series. While at Marvel, Bob launched the first miniseries in comics history, and he was also instrumental in Valiant Comics' meteoric success in the 1990s. Since 2007, Bob has turned his attention towards developing new properties for motion pictures and television, and he has creative credits in 7 Marvel films and a host of other television and movie acknowledgments. Here's my conversation with Bob Layton. Thanks for taking time to talk with us today, Bob.
Oh, it's my pleasure, John.
So let's start at the beginning. I believe you were born and raised in Indiana, Indianapolis to be exact, and comics were part of your life from an early age. Talk about that.
I learned to read off comics when I was only 4 years old. My sister, Sue Ann, got bored with reading them to me all the time, and so she decided to teach me how to read. And subsequently, I was able to skip a grade of school because I went into grade school already reading proficiently, and actually graduated from high school a year early at 17. But from that early time, because I was so just enamored with the artwork, and I could tell the continuity of drawing from panel to panel, I could tell what was happening, and it made me want to know what they were saying. And that drove me to learn how to read as a child. And that put the hook in me in terms of the power of the medium. That particular art form, that unique art form. I mean, from that point on, it was like, it was something that, struck me as powerful and entertaining and, for me, a great escape.
And did I read correctly that you actually started selling comics out of your apartment when you were young?
Well, we're talking about the salad days. Like I said, John, when I graduated at 17, so I could not actually go get a job somewhere, I grew up relatively poor, so college wasn't in my future. So I took it upon myself to start self-educating in terms of art, in terms of writing. And the way I supplemented my income was I started selling comic books locally because distribution of comic books in those days were spotty. So what I did was I contacted the local distributor and bought bulk, and then sold them through a newspaper, something called the Buyer's Guide. It was like a weekly newspaper that these classified ads in, and that's how I kind of supplemented my income while I worked on my drawing and writing and everything else while I was in the process of self-educating.
So comics were obviously in your blood very early, but it's one thing to like them, and it's completely different to create them. How did you learn the artistic side of things as well as the storytelling aspect?
Well, I never had a fireman or policeman stage. From the time I read my first comic, I was kind of hooked. And when I discovered that human beings actually drew those things, I was stunned. So telling stories just became my driving force, is what I wanted to do more than anything. And eventually that led to me creating a fanzine in Indianapolis. Back before the internet, the only way fans could kind of congregate or you could express yourself was through like amateur publications. So I ran into a comic fan named Roger Stern, who lived there in Indianapolis as well. He worked at a radio station there. And the two of us got this idea of turning my comic catalog into a fanzine where we did reviews and, we did articles about comics and stuff like that. And that was really my first little entrepreneurish venture into publishing. And that's what I used to do, was send 25 copies to Marvel and to DC and to any other company that was out there, with the hope that somebody would pick them up and read them and see my artwork or see our stories and so forth and so on in there. And that's kind of how I got started.
And would you consider that your first, quote unquote, official job in the industry?
Well, fanzines are still fan fiction, basically, so I don't know if that you would consider that professional job, but it definitely was my first venture into being an entrepreneur of sorts. It's like we used to have stapling parties in my apartment where everyone would get together and collate all this stuff and put them together with a saddle stitcher. I don't know how professional that was. But what it did was it eventually led to Roger and I creating a relationship with Charlton Comics, which was like a smaller publisher out of Derby, Connecticut. And there we started producing a fanzine based on their characters, past and present. They kind of commissioned us to help them get a bigger fan presence. So we started publishing this fanzine called the Charlton Bullseye. And
where did contemporary pictorial literature come in?
Well, that was the predecessor to the Charlton Bullseye. That was the name that we had given to our little digest fanzine that we put out every month. Which contemporary pictorial literature was basically, our CPL, as everyone called it, was basically a high-blown name for comic books. It's contemporary pictorial literature.
Right.
So that's where it came from, basically. And we published that for about 2 years. And I actually wound up making a deal with Phil Silly and Bud Plant, who were two of the largest distributors of art books and things of that nature in those days, in the early 70s. And we went into partnership with them, and they actually financed each publication and split the print run between them, and they did the distribution. So actually, like I said, from an early age, I was 19 maybe, it's like I'm running a publishing business out of the back room of my apartment.
So now let's move to the mid-1970s, and you connect with Marvel Comics. There are a million different directions we could go here, but I just want to step back and give you the floor. Tell us how you got there, what you did, the important parts of your story along the way with Marvel.
Well, I actually started my career with Charlton Comics, based out of Derby, Connecticut. My first work was there. But Charlton paid horribly, and they actually had their offices in a bowling alley. It was kind of crazy. There's a whole documentary being made about it, about Charlton Comics. I was referred to it as the three-legged dog of comic book publishers. But what happened is that while I was working there at Charlton, I had moved to the East Coast because I got an offer to come work with Wally Wood, one of the giants of the comic industry, as his apprentice. And that's how you got into the business, was, basically you would work for years as an apprentice to an established artist. And then eventually, because there were so few books being published in those days, you kind of had to wait for someone to die or move on to some other job before you could get a book. So most of us spent our time doing background art and, sweeping the floors, whatever we had to do for, established artists. And what happened was, how I connected with Marvel was, I used to deliver pages for Woody because he hated going into New York. So, and back then you had to live in the tri-state area because they didn't have FedEx, and you couldn't, send it via internet or anything like that. There was no internet. So I would get on the train and I would take stuff in to Marvel and to DC, wherever Woody was doing work, because I figured that was the best way for me to get my foot in the door, was actually get to know these people and meet these people, and I would take my own samples up. And it happened to be one day I was delivering pages to Marvel, and John Romita was there, and he was like beside himself because the regular inker on one of their books was ill, and he only had 3 days to get this book inked. And this has become like an urban legend, this story. And I convinced him that I could ink the book in 3 days. It usually takes, if you do 2 pages a day, it'll take you, 14 days to do a book, right? And right. I could convince him I could do it in 3. He gave me the book. I went over to Continuity Associates, which was an advertising firm run by Neil Adams and Dick Giordano. and it was filled full of apprentices who were now like, household names in the comic industry. And I just convinced everybody to just jam on the thing with me. And we stayed up for 3 days and we finished the book, and I turned it in. And on the train back home, 3 days without sleep, and I'm taking the train back home, and I'm realizing, oh my God, what have I done? I have just destroyed my career. And about 2 weeks later, I get this package, and I open it up, and it's an entire issue of the Champions, and it's in pencil. And it was penciled by Bob Hall, who was one of the guys that worked with us on CPL, right? And I'm thinking, oh, this must be a mistake. So I called John Romita. I said, you sent this to the wrong Bob. And he goes, no. He goes, you did exactly what you said you were going to do, and this is your reward. This is your new book. And so that's actually how I got started.
And so while you're at Marvel, you're obviously most known for Iron Man. How did that whole thing happen?
Well, after I did Champions, I actually went to DC for a year. They paid $5 more a page, and back then the pay was so terrible. For $5 a page, you'd work for the devil. So I did a year at DC, but then DC was about to cancel a third of their line. And so I convinced David Michelini, who I was working with, to come over to Marvel with me because I'd been there before. So we went over to Marvel and we tried out. We, as I said, we wanted to get something regular there. What they used to do in those days was when a book wasn't selling well, they would take their A-list guys off and put their B-list or new guys on to kind of give them a tryout or whatever. Because these books, they signed a 12-month contract with the distributors, newsstand distributors, right? So by the 6th issue of that year, they kind of had an idea whether the book was going to sell or not. So they would take John Romita, or they would take John Buscema or whoever, or Jack Kirby off the book, and they would put schmucks like us on until the book ran out, right? Okay. Now, Iron Man was something I despised as a kid. I always thought they just missed the mark on it entirely. So I convinced David to take Iron Man. It was one of the things they offered. I said, trust me, this is the book we want to do. Because I had a million ideas. I used to make my own Iron Man comics when I was a kid. I used to draw on notebook paper and stuff like that. I felt like they had totally gotten wrong because the book obviously was going to get canceled. So I asked them, can we change a few things? And they're like, we don't care. We're going to cancel the book, right? So the Iron Man that you know now, right, was basically came from that. From that point on, we took over the book, started making wholesale changes, and we created the Rockstar Tony Stark character, the variant armors, we introduced Rhodey and Justin Hammer and all those characters, right? 6 months later, it was one of their top 10 selling books, so the rest is history, as they say.
Wow. And all of that came just because you didn't agree with the direction they were going. They were going to cancel it, and you said, all right, I'll just take it in a new direction.
It's so silly, but yeah, I just thought the book just never made any sense to me, I mean, because it was never about Tony Stark. As a 15-year-old boy, I didn't want to be Iron Man. I wanted to be Tony Stark. I mean, I wanted all the girls and all the money and all the toys. I wanted to be the smartest guy in the room. I mean, that's a 15-year-old power fantasy that's attainable, So to me, it's like the emphasis was always on Iron Man. And to me, that was totally wrong. I said I wanted to create – Tony Stark should be a rock star. When he walks into a room, people should lose their minds, right? And that's really kind of what I brought to the series, along with the fact that I tried to make the science more believable, and I tried to show that he was an incredibly creative guy and that he would create specific armors for specific tasks. And I wanted to get rid of his pantheon of dumb villains. And John, the best way to describe it, there were two kinds of books at Marvel in those days. There was an A-list book and a B-list book. An A-list book was, like the Avengers or Thor or, one of those kind of things. And the writers usually applied themselves, or Spider-Man, and they applied themselves to it wholeheartedly. But then there was the one book they did to pay the rent. All right, that was the B-list books, And that's when you get your Ghost Riders and your Spider-Woman, and unfortunately Iron Man. Nobody really ever gave that character any love. People don't realize that Stan never actually wrote it. He came up with the idea and gave it to his brother Larry, who, bless his heart, was no Stan Lee. And I can say this with some impunity because years ago they were putting out a compilation of the Tales of Suspense. It was their very first early Iron Man. They asked me to write the introduction. And I had to go back and read them. horrible. Oh my God. So I wrote an essay on how communism changed my life for the better. Because back in the early days of Marvel, everybody was a commie. All the bad guys were commies. And honest to God, until I was 11 years old, I thought Nikita Khrushchev was a Marvel character because he appeared in almost every book, banging his shoe on a podium. And I had no idea until I was 11 years old, he was actually a real person.
So after Marvel in the 1990s, you were instrumental in Valiant Comics' growth and success. How did that opportunity come to you, and how is it different from being at Marvel?
I'll tell you a quick story. It's the best way to describe it. When I worked at Continuity, there was an inker there, an incredible inker named Jack Abel. Wonderful, wonderful guy. He was working at Marvel at the time that I was there. So Jack had a stroke. He wound up losing his ability to use his right side, so he couldn't draw anymore. And Marvel was kind enough to give him a job as a proofreader, but I could just tell he was miserable. Okay, and Dick Giordano, who was a mentor to me, after Woody retired, I went to work for Dick Giordano at Continuity, and Dickie remained my mentor through my entire life. But one of the things he always emphasized to me is to learn every aspect of the business, not just the drawing part or the writing part, but to, understand the business that you're in. So I used to spend a lot of time on the 11th floor of Marvel, which was accounting, which I was probably the only freelancer who ever went up there. And it all kind of came to me when Jack had the stroke that the only way I was really going to make a difference in this industry was if I actually owned a piece of it. Otherwise I'm just going to be a wage slave and do the same thing until I drop dead. So that when Steve Mazzarski and Jim Shooter had gotten the venture capital money to start a new company, Jim, who had always relied on me to be his sort of idea guy, convinced me to leave Marvel, because I was on contract there, to leave Marvel, to come over there and help create the Valiant line. And so that's what I did. I decided to take a chance. It was like I didn't want to wind up like Jack and just doing the same thing for the rest of my life or whatever. So I figured, although I had trepidations about Jim, I figured it was worth the risk. So I left in '89 and went to work at Valiant there as production manager, inker, writer, you name it or whatever. I was doing just about everything up there. The problem came up when Steve and Jim decided that instead of doing the actual superhero comics that I came over to do, that they'd gotten the license to Nintendo and the WWF. And I argued with them that, those are audiences that are both notorious for not reading. I mean, people who play video games don't want to read comic books about video games. They want to play video games, right? They put millions into that and blew it all without making a cent. And so they had to go back to the venture capital people, this group Triumph, who basically financed and tried to get more money so we could start the superhero line. So it was a real touch and go thing there for a while, and eventually, like I said, it cost Jim his job. Although Jim was a really good writer, but a very, very poor businessman. And he went through their money like water, and venture capital guys, they don't appreciate that, not too much.
Right.
So eventually he was fired for cause, and since I was running the place day to day anyway, and said most of the characters had come out of my brain, it was a simple thing. Triumph came to me and said, we're willing to back you on this if we go ahead with the superhero stuff. So that's what happened. And the rest is history, as they say.
And your ability to be successful there, in large part, probably came from your early years of learning to be an entrepreneur as opposed to someone who's just drawing, right?
I love parallel construction, don't you?
Yeah.
I think we just accomplished that, didn't we?
Yes.
Yes, exactly. That and the fact that Dick Giordano was always emphasizing to me or encouraging the entrepreneurial side of me as well. So, at Valiant, I had to learn the ins and outs of production. I had to, I had to budget meetings. I had all these sort of things that I never had to deal with at Marvel. But at the same time, it was an incredible growing and learning experience. Plus, unlike other companies, most of the creatives worked in-house. I tried to set it up like the old studio system back in the 50s in comics. So most of the guys that worked on the books actually had desks there in the office. It became a very close, tight-knit family kind of environment. It was really an incredibly wonderful time. And, it's like we wound up being the third largest publisher in America.
So then fast forward to 2007, and you changed your focus a bit and set your sights on more film and television. Was that a natural evolution for your career, or was there a specific reason that happened?
Yeah, there was a specific reason. It was called Iron Man, the movie. In 2007, I got a call asking me to come out and work on DVD special features for the first Iron Man film. So I went out to Hollywood. By that time, I had left comics anyway. I had my own website, and I was publishing a webcomic called Colony. So I was always trying to find the next thing that was happening. And to me, webcomics seemed to be a natural extension from publishing because, you can get it globally. It didn't cost. It was free, too, on my website. I would publish 5 pages a month. And, it was like I generated a lot of income from that website as well by, selling merchandise and stuff. So I was doing that here in Florida when I got the call to come out to Hollywood. So I went out there, and of course I got the bug because after that had been 30 years or something, 35 years in comics or whatever. I had owned 2 comic book companies, Valiant and Future. I had worked on every character. I had 6,400 comic book credits, So when I got to Hollywood and I saw how production happens and the creative process there, it seemed to be a natural extension of where to go next with my life. Is still telling stories. I always felt like I was a writer who posed as an artist. To be honest with you, I got in as an artist because it was easier than getting in as a writer. Because most writers could write 2-3 books a month. Most artists could only do 1. So there was always a need for art, but I always felt that, my first love was story. So being in Hollywood, it seemed like a natural progression for me. So I was fortunate enough to work with Marvel Studios and, work with the principals involved, Jon Favreau and Robert Downey. And it was amazing. It put the hook into me. I said, well, okay, I'm going to move to Hollywood and I'm going to work out 3 years. And if it doesn't work out, I'll come back to Florida, right? So 3 years turned into 5 years, and 5 years turned into 8 years.
Right.
Yeah, because the things just kept happening. So what started out as, okay, I give it a few years, it turned into almost a decade.
And I may know the answer to this because you kind of touched on it, but this is more of an opinion question, but I'm curious to your response and your reasoning. What is more important to you when you're involved in a project? Is it the visuals or is it the story?
Well, it's hard for me to divorce one from the other because both mediums rely on it. But let me go back to a Wally Wood saying, something that Woody always said, and it stuck with me my whole life. He says that in order to be a great storyteller, everyone involved must be a slave to the story, that you must put your ego aside and the story comes first. So I had that inculcated into my thinking from a very early time. If you go back and look at my entire career, you'll find very few comics where I just did the art and nothing else. I was always involved in plotting the stories or writing the stories, because the story is everything. What people remember from my Iron Mans over the years, and I did like 130 of them or whatever, it's not the individual pictures, it's the stories that we told. The passion to me was always characters, everything. Character and conflict are everything. So that's the thing. I mean, writing comics and writing film or television is very, very different. But that's the thing that's the same about it, is that character and conflict are everything.
Interesting. And Bob, when you first started, everything was done by hand, and now technology is involved in every process, whether it's comics or filmmaking. Besides the technological advances, how have things changed in the way you do your work?
I don't have to live in New York anymore, you know? What's amazing, the reason I moved back to Florida is what changed about the comic industry has changed about Hollywood. 4 years ago, I was working on a project with Michael Olmos, right? And I was doing art design for a film that he was doing. At home that night, I would do some sketches. I'd scan them. I'd send them to Mike. And, he'd send me his comments back and forth and whatever. And I realized that I had worked on this film with him without ever talking to him face to face or driving into L.A. I'm like, what am I doing here? If I no longer need to actually be here, why am I here? Florida is infinitely cheaper to live. It's sunny all the time, and I have family here, and there's no state tax. So right. I came back. But technology was the reason for that. And comics, now if I do a cover for Valiant, because since Valiant was one of my brainchild, I'm one of the few founding members that are still around. They asked me to do covers, right? So from time to time I'll do a cover. So I'll do a sketch, and I'll transmit the sketch to the editor. He'll approve it and not, and then I will draw it. I'll scan it, and I'll send a high-res version to them, and that's the end of it. Or if I have to actually send the original, I pop it in FedEx, it's there the next day. So thank God we live in this time. And so for a creator, it's wonderful. Because like I said, in the early days, we all had to live in the tri-state area and take the trains in just to deliver stuff because the mails were so slow back then. They didn't even have priority mail in those days. So as far as doing art on a computer, although I've done that, I'm not a fan of that because after 45 years, I have a huge following, and there's something to be said for doing it the old-fashioned way because you can sell that. So,
right.
If I do a Comic-Con or some kind of thing like that, I can sell it for a reasonable amount of money, but nobody's going to buy a file that I have, So I still do it the OG way because, people want to own the physical art.
And I'm sure people ask you all the time how they can get in the industry, follow in your footsteps. What do you tell them?
I haven't a clue, Jeff. To be honest with you, because I started 45 years ago when there were only 40 comics being published through the entire industry. All right. Like I told you, you usually had to wait for someone to die and you moved up by attrition. I have no idea how one would get into the business now. I know that Comic-Cons, most of the companies are always doing art portfolios where they sit down with creators and they do a review or whatever of your work. And I guess that would be one way to get in. In Hollywood, I had the advantage because they were making movies out of comics I created. So
right.
that put my foot in the door. In fact, the first TV show I ever worked on was Iron Man Armor Adventures at Nicktoons because the showrunner said, we've been ripping off your stories for years, and we figured we might as well just come to the source. How would you like to write some episodes? So that was my first television work. But I had an advantage that somebody coming up today didn't have. And so I just think, one, set your standards high, and two, be sincere. Have something to say. It's always important. I mean, I know it's just entertainment. We're not curing cancer or anything, but you never know when you do something that'll change somebody's life. Somebody drew a comic that was so meaningful to me that I devoted my entire life to the art form, okay? Right. I'm sure for him it was just another job, But there's a sincerity to what you do. If you have something to say, even in something as simple as a comic or something as complex as a movie, have something to say. I think that's the best advice I could give anyone.
That is actually great advice. These days, I know, as you mentioned, you live in Florida, but I know you travel a lot to different conferences and shows. What's a typical day or week for you now?
I just never know what tomorrow brings. I mean, like last year, let's just take this last year. I was on the set of Bloodshot in South Africa. I was in Dubai for 2 weeks meeting with Sheikh Mohammed. I was in Monterrey, Mexico. My travels, my business, it takes me all over the world. I was in Japan 2 months ago. One, is doing Comic Cons. The other one is chasing money for my film company. So, either way, it's like I have had the most incredible experiences. The last year has been amazing. Doing a convention in Dubai with 75,000 people in an Arab country come out, right? It's crazy. As I said, meeting with Sheikh Mohammed, who turns out to be a huge Iron Man fan. It's crazy. I went on vacation in Tokyo and wound up finding financial help for my film company. It takes me all over the world. I mean, it also takes me to not so glamorous places too, but the point is I still get to meet with my fans, and I still get to enjoy the fruits of my labors now, because so much of what I've done has made it to film and television. These characters that started out obscure are now becoming part of the lexicon of entertainment. It's been an amazing, amazing ride for me.
In your time doing this work, did you ever think, is anybody watching? Is anybody reading? Does anybody really care? And then you get to some of these things and it's kind of just slaps you in the face, holy cow, my work is appreciated by a lot of people. What's that feeling?
It's indescribable. Let me tell you, because I had a moment like that. This is where Dick Giordano, who was one of my dearest friends, who passed away about 10 years ago, he was the father I never had. And I remember there was a point in my career where I went to him and I just said, why are we doing this? I said, it's so stupid. We're not curing cancer. I'm not Joe the Salt. We're doing stupid comic book stories. And that's when he said that line to me. He's the one who actually said, do you remember the comic that you read that made you want to devote your life to this? And I said, yeah. And he goes, do you think that guy gave a damn about you when he was doing it? No, he was paying his bills. It was just another book to him. It was just his job. But for you, it was powerful enough to change your life. He goes, you'll never know if what you're doing is going to affect someone in a positive way. You don't get a reward. You just have to hope that in some way you touch someone. And when we did Demon in a Bottle, the famous Iron Man alcoholism story, to this day, okay, that was 40-something years ago. To this day, I have become the unofficial spokesperson for sobriety in the comic book industry. I get letters 2 or 3 weeks sometimes from people who are struggling with alcoholism, who ask my advice, who say how much that story, what it meant to them, or how it had changed their life. And you don't think about those things when you're doing it. It was a story, and we moved on to the next one. You never know what you're going to do, how it's going to affect somebody. You just have to keep doing it and not expecting a reward. But the point of it is, if you have something to say, truly, it's going to have an effect on someone. When I went to the set of Iron Man, for the first time, the most crazy thing in the world was David Maisel, the founder of Marvel Studios, is the biggest Bob Layton comic book fan in the world. I mean, his office is like a Bob Layton Iron Man art museum. Wow. It was no coincidence that Iron Man was the first movie they did. And he said to me, the greatest compliment I ever got was, David said to me that there would be no Marvel Studios if it wasn't for my love of your work. Think about that. I mean, I'm not taking credit for Marvel Studios, but the point of it is, this is what the guy who founded the thing said to me,
Yeah, you had an impact on him.
Yeah. I get to the set, and there's Downey and Favreau, and they got trade paperbacks of Iron Man, and they fanboy out on me. They want me to autograph. I was so taken aback by that, because I didn't expect that, for them to have that reaction to me. Because to me, I was just doing my job. I was doing what I was hired to do, doing what I loved. If you do it right, people are going to be affected by it, and they're going to be affected positively by it.
Well, Bob, I'm actually really curious about this one, both personally and for the podcast, but what's next for you? What should people be looking out for?
I love a good plug. All right, here we go. All right. One of the reasons I moved back to Florida was initially I was offered by Chinese investors to start my own film production company. They wanted to do something to inject some life into the Florida film industry, because as you know, this is something we've all been struggling with here, trying to get Florida back into the mainstream of film and television, right? it seems so illogical for me that we aren't a hub for film and television. Given the great weather and the great locations and everything like that. But unfortunately, that deal fell through after the election. The Chinese, as you know, you're probably very aware of this, John, that the Chinese pulled out of Hollywood altogether.
Right.
But I had the makings of my own film production company, so I started Box Monkey Pictures. And Box Monkey Pictures with my ex-girlfriend, who was a fabulous AD for 15 years on movies like City Hall and The Wedding Singer in Philadelphia. Michelle Grant, she and I formed this company, and we are getting ready to start production first quarter of 2020 on my first major feature film, The Helix.
Excellent. That is exciting.
Yeah, we'll be filming in Sweden. We made a deal with the Swedish government. They're very, very good about supporting the arts there. Our director, Marcus Avnell, he's a very accomplished and award-winning young director there. And since he has a relationship with everybody there, we're getting all sorts of incentives to shoot there. I would love to do our second film here in Florida. It's a tropical setting anyway, so it would be absolutely perfect. So once we finish The Helix, I'm hoping that we'll be able to do the next one here.
Well, that would actually be terrific to have you be able to stay at home and also contribute to the Florida film community, because I know you want to do that.
I'm devoted to that. I know Film Florida is as well. I'm totally devoted to doing what I can to turn the situation around here and make this more film friendly. It should be. Don't you agree?
I totally agree. I mean, I've kind of devoted the last 5 years of my life to it, and no looking back now. And it's too important to not do it. There's too much money available, too much positive impact for the economy, for tourism, for jobs, all of those things. As you said, it just makes perfect sense. And so it's too important to give up.
We have to change the climate in Tallahassee. We have to lure as many people here as we can and as much money here as we can, so that this can become a hub for film and television. I think I still think it's doable. I'm a believer in that. And here I am, with my Box Monkey Pictures right here in Florida. I would much rather be able to sleep in my own bed at night after a day's shoot.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So let's keep our fingers crossed, and I'm going to do everything I can to work on that. In the meantime, right now I'm out promoting Bloodshot, the Sony film based on my Valiant character, starring Vin Diesel and Guy Pearce. That's premiering in February 21st, 2020.
Bob, thanks for sharing your expertise with us today. It truly was an honor to speak with you, and I know for the people listening, they'll appreciate the stories and the career advice. If people want to keep up with you, where can they find you online?
Well, I am all over social media like a rash. I spend 90 minutes every morning basically posting on social media and reading the trades. But I have my own website, boblayton.com, but I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram. Very easy to find me. I'll have the Box Monkey Pictures site up in a few weeks, so they can go to boxmonkeypictures.com for updates on our film projects. And I'll be coming to a Comic-Con near you.
Bob, I really appreciate the time. This has been great.
Hey, man, it's wonderful. Good luck with everything, I was looking at the website. It's awesome, It's like anything I can ever do to help, just let me know, okay?
I will probably take you up on that offer, so we'll keep in touch.
Okay, John.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Film Florida podcast. For more information about Film Florida, go to filmflorida.org or visit our social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Check out the Film Florida merchandise at teespring.com/stores/filmflorida, and please remember to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast.